Everyone. I guess we're perhaps good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the July edition of the Community Modeling Simulation Forum for Forge. A little bit of a departure today of some of the ways we normally do it. So more of just of a discussion, a back and forth. So I'm hoping everyone is coming on ready to engage in some questions and some dialogue as we get to some important transitions here in Forge. So lots of stuff going on. I'm going to start. If I can get my screen to work. Just the agenda for today. I'm going to give an update on the availability of the data from the 16A stimulation. Then I'm going to give a fairly lengthy overview of the 16B preliminary design. Now, I shamelessly stole slides from John McLennan and also from Ben Dyer and Chris Pankow from our reservoir engineering and our seismic team. It's going to kind of drive that discussion. John can't be here, and if he was, he would take what should be a 10-minute presentation. He'd probably take it to an hour because he's so passionate about it. So I'm going to subvert that. I probably won't do it justice, but I'll get to the key points that we as a modeling team at least need to know for where we're at in discussion. And then the most important part of this is an open discussion regarding 16B design and also testing. I think we're getting into the heat or the heart of things that I feel very strongly about for Forge, and that is essentially fluid flow, heat transport, actually the operating and using the heat exchanger that we're creating by stimulation. So how do we want to test that? I want to get as much community input as right now we are beginning the planning for some of our short and long-term flow tests. So I think it's important to get as much input on this process as we can as we start designing these things and doing our work. Everyone here, your input is important. So with that, I am going to start ahead. If you have questions, please, you can either raise your hand or submit a thing in the chat. I'll try to probably stop as I go. I mean, this is meant to be more of a dialogue, not a monologue, but I'm the only person on the agenda as a formally speaking. So feel free to interrupt me. So availability of the data. So the pressure and flow rates. So all, I think I mentioned this last time, the complete data sets are available. The modeling team has done some other processing to clean it up a bit to make it easier to put it in the models. What we've done, is internally hasn't been released on GDR, but the raw data sets are on GDR now. I don't have the number here in the table. I probably should get that on there, but it is available. The important new revelation that just happened, I just learned yesterday. So the microseismic team has been very diligently working to post-process the data. And I'm going to go into some of this here as I go on, so I won't talk in too much detail. But some of the hypocenters will be released this week. So we will have spatial locations, time, and magnitudes for a select subset of the microseismic data from the 16B or 16A stimulation. I think we'll have it from the processors this week. When it makes it to GDR, I think we're very shortly after, and you'll likely see a notice come about from the Forge team via some of our social media channels or from our email. I know a lot of people have been looking for this information, and some of it's finally going to be in hand. Water samples, tracer data. Numerous water samples were collected, pre and post injection during the stimulations. They're being analyzed now. Some of the tracer data is also being cleaned up and polished. We're hoping that by the end of July, we will have all those. That end of July, if history repeats itself, that may be a bit optimistic, but it is moving forward. A lot of analysis is going on. It's very important information to look at closely. So the last thing is specifically related to the 16A stimulation of some of the strain. Surface locations were monitored. They had some issues with telemetry, but actually I'm happy to report that the data are in hand. So the folks from Clemson did send me their results. I haven't looked at them yet. I don't believe they've made it to GDR, but we are going to be looking at that really soon. I'm not sure who will end up releasing that and posting that to the community, but once it happens, once again, I can send a note out to if you're on the modeling mailing list, we'll make sure you know when those data are available. So I'm going to start into some of the things talking about 16B. As you know, 16A has been drilled. It's shown here on the screen. There's our trajectory of 16A. There's the end of the well for the offset, 4,000 feet or so offset from the wellhead. Simulations have been conducted. The well is pretty well dialed in. You can see here on the graph, on the map, everything in white is a well that is already there, either for our monitoring system or our actual production. So there's been a whole lot of discussion of drilling the next well 16B 7832, and there's a whole plethora of things that we need to accomplish with 16B. But this is one of John McLennan's slides, and next of them, most of them will be. And so I would say the most important objective at this time for Forge is that we need to establish a connection between 16A and 16B with the hydraulic fractures that we created. That is the primary top tier that trumps everything else objective for well 16B. Now, that doesn't say there aren't other things we're going to be doing in 16B that are very, very important. But if we don't establish that connection, then we'll have to do a whole lot of remedial stimulation or other work. So that is our main goal. And so that kind of comes into some of the key things that's driving the design of 16B. Now, once again, these are some John slides. He borrowed some of this information from our colleagues at GeoEnergy Swiss and from the Seismic team who are processing the data. So, some of the design, and we talked about this with a stat, is to make as little or as few potential variables as we try to evaluate different stimulation techniques in Forge for this initial well. And I will say also that additional and other than B, an additional long reach sub-horizontal well is currently in the plan right now. It's something we're working with DOE to extend the project to have additional long reach well. So the point I want to make with this slide is 16B will be built essentially to mirror 16A, but it'll be some distance above, be vertically offset by some distance. And that distance is something I'd like to talk about with this group here today. What you're seeing here on in this image are preliminary, and you notice this is do not distribute. This is a preliminary provisional data. Shown here are some of the seismic data that has been processed. What you're seeing here is the red hypocenters are from the open hole toe stimulation, the first fracturing job that was created. The green are from the second or the first perforation zone, and the blue is from the final or the third stimulation. This is essentially an oblique view. Nominally, this height above the well is between 400 and 450 feet. Once again, those data will be available to be shared here very, very soon, and we'll be able to work from there. Shown here actually in map view, we can actually see that there is some difference in the characteristics of what the data that we got back looks like. Some of that has to do with issues that we had with the monitoring system, and that's what the seismic team is working so diligently to actually make to clean these data up and do the best they can to post-process them because of some issues we had with the field collection system. This is an important little graph here. It actually kind of shows them. I marked these as provisional. They are essentially work in progress. So you're seeing these early. These have been seen by a few other people. But what you're seeing here on this graph is essentially the seismic data that we will be using to help guide our decisions as far as where 16B will be located. But what you're seeing here, essentially number of events per 10 minutes, that is the gray histograms. We have pressure plots in black and some of the auto detect locations that have been visually checked. So basically, I believe I don't have my note in front of me for this slide, but I believe there at the time this slide was presented, we had essentially 30,000 or more triggered events. Of those, only a small fraction was auto-located, and I believe over 5,000 or so are being manually checked. What's going to be in the final catalog gets released will be determined here really soon. The magnitude, the range is from -2.3 to 0.5. There's still a lot of work being done with these. That's why I'm calling it provisional. But hopefully we'll be able to see this really, really soon. Why it's important here as we get forward is my screen would cooperate. Sorry. So the vertical resolution. So as I said, we had some issues with the completeness of our monitoring system as the testing went on. So early in the stimulation testing, we had some failures from our seismic strings for any number of reasons that I won't get in here today. But our stage 3, the team was actually able to, through a Herculean effort, get essentially a monitoring system cleaned up and functioning as good as humanly possible. And so what you're seeing here essentially are some of the detections that process from stage 3 of the third stimulation, which is this blue band here, which you can see. And the color in the background represents the accuracy or the error potentially for PNS peak accuracies of ±1 millisecond. where we get location accuracies in both the horizontal and the vertical. And so they've done a really good job here. We say it's pretty tight bands for the location accuracies in the plus or minus, less than 30 feet, a little bit higher, I believe, for the vertical. But regardless, that's essentially pretty good data set. Now, where this becomes important, I think this is, I'm going to just kind of move on because this isn't the key part of the talk, but it does factor into the kind of data we'll have. So the worst case for the resolutions came from stages 1 and 2. We didn't have as much of the monitoring system functional. And you can see the same color scheme here for the accuracy for the events for stage 1 and 2, which are shown in this case in red and black, where you can see kind of a bit greater, plus or minus 70 to maybe 80 or more feet in some of those locations. What the finals end up will be, I don't know, but we'll see. As I said, we'll be seeing that data soon. But why it's important, I'm going to skip by that one. Why it's important, it kind of goes into how we plan and we work on 16B. So here is the current design of well 16B. It has been thought through a lot by the well engineering team, the reservoir engineering. The stat has weighed in multiple times. Essentially what this well is by and large, it is a mirror, as I said earlier, of well 16A, but it will be some vertical offset above 16A. What's important here is what we're going to end up with is there's a whole bunch of essentially cased and cemented casing in here in order to accommodate some of the monitoring from some of the R&D projects and some of the instrumentation that has to be put in this well. But what's important to note here is, this is a 7-inch well. It's a very heavy casing. I believe it's 38 pound per foot. T95 or equivalent. So basically our inside diameter is going to be in the order of 5.9 inches inside this casing. Importantly here, the drilling team has spec'd out approximately 500 feet of open hole toe to go throughout the bottom of this to look at some of the previous work, see if we could find some of the fractures from the 16A stimulation. So that was a very fast, quick update of where we're at right now in talking about 16A and 16B and the testing. But I want to have kind of a general summary of things that are mostly settled and things that we are under consideration and or planning in regard to 16A and 16B. So here on the left is some things that are like mostly settled. So that casing and cementing schedule, the casing size, the casing shoot to surface, that is pretty much settled. And I think I did see Joe Moore pop in. So Joe, you're welcome to weigh in here and correct me if I'm wrong on any of these. We're talking this from a modeling perspective, but I believe I've gone through and settled some of our recent discussions. And I do see someone hit the chat. I'm going to finish this slide, and then I'll come back into the answer that question. The kickoff point and the trajectory it will be directly above 16A. It seems for right now that is probably the highest propensity of center of mass for the microseismic detections. And so that's going to be the basic target, to be as low risk as possible in connecting 16B with 16A without having to do remedial stimulation in B initially. So, and the last part here, I think the instrumentation package, there are multiple fiber strings planned that will be cemented and set outside of the 16B casing. I believe that packages are being worked with the external R&D community, and I think that is pretty much settled as well. I am going to look at this comment that came over the chat. Eric, I'll talk to you about that later. I'm not going to dive into the, Eric Sonnethal asked a question about the microseismic starting before some of the pressure, before the injection. As I said, I'm not going to dive into some of those. That is still provisional. It's still being worked. So I'm going to hold off on that one. I think we'll have a much better informed discussion of that come in about a week's time. So I'm going to leave that one go, Eric. Sorry to punt on that one, but that's the best I want to do. I don't want to get myself underwater with that discussion, but I honestly don't know. If someone from the seismic team is here and would like to comment on that, I will open the floor to them to answer that question. But in lieu of that, I am going to just continue moving on. So moving over to the right here, the still under consideration and or planning. So this is one of the biggest things that we need to think about is the vertical offset between 16A and 16B. As a modeling team, we're going to make one set of recommendations to the overall project. That's only going to be one voice among many in here, but I'm going to talk about that and how we could better inform that as a modeling team. I want to gather your input as a group. The length of the open hole toe, so there's 500 feet currently planned to be open hole at the end of 16B. I think we can make an argument. I think we may be able to influence that as a team, but I think we have to have a really good argument in order to change that. So I think it's been pretty well thought out. It is something I think we could probably try to influence if we can. Now, the real main point I want to bring up with the group here with you today is 3 different ways to look at connecting or testing these hydraulic connections between 16A and 16B. Kayla, I see your question. I'll get to that in 1 second. So initially, we need to do a very short term while the drill rig is still on site, a simple test to confirm some hydraulic connection between A and B. That could be just simply pressuring up A, looking for a pressure response, pumping some fluid in. I'm curious. I'm actually not going to say what I think we should do. I'm going to ask the question to you in the meeting, and we'll have some roundtable discussions. The second part is the stimulated fracture characterization. Now, as you know, we did 3 different techniques for how we did stimulations. There was open hole, there was a frac with essentially just water, and there was a frac with some fluid additives, and things for between the 3 different zones. We need to do some quantitative comparison of those stimulations so we can have some good information and feedback to the community. I'm curious, is anybody's input for some best ways to possibly do that? And also, we're just starting to explore longer term interwell flow testing. So we're really looking at heat and mass transfer, stress evolution, geochemistry. We're looking at sustainability and essentially heat mining in these systems. And so that is another big part that we'll have to start planning here. So, okay, so I'm going to go back up to, I do not have help with, okay. So the question for how much of 16B will be cased? So right now, essentially the casing will run from essentially the bottom of the measured length at 10,006. The casing would end at about 10,200 feet measured depth. There will be a total well will be about 10,700 feet. So there, as I said, 500 feet open hole. Now so this case well will later will be perfed to essentially try to hit areas where fracturing other stimulation efforts happen in 16A, where they encounter B will come back through and perf into 16A to potentially capture that stimulated zone. I understand the challenging part to produce from those rates, and that's something that we have been looking at, and I'll talk more about that. Actually, I have a few teaser slides at the end. But there's other important considerations as to why this well will be cased and cemented other than the open hole toe. And that has to do with some mechanical effects from doing stimulation. I think we've seen some pretty good results from the Sigma V project, where the work that's going on at the Homestake mine for each collab EGS project, where essentially they try to do the stimulations. Those stimulations get arrested by the open hole wells that are nearby. That was done on purpose there to stop fracture propagation because it's a pressure sink as the fluid moves through. But we don't want to have that for Forge right now. So basically, this is what has been deemed to be the safest and most way to be able to actually do this and do continued testing. So McCool's question for seismic data, just looking at different views. No, I do not have any other views for the seismic data. As I said, those are provisional slides provided by the seismic team. The actual raw result or the process results will be made available. So we can look at those in any number of extents on our own, hopefully within the next week. I'm not going to dive too much deeper. I don't have much more to say other than right now, the seismic data, it's interesting. And it looks like it's lots of upward growth, very little downward growth, and it's supported this year. So this gets me to the point where essentially I wanted to start some discussions, and I'm hoping people will weigh in and not be shy. So basically what you're seeing here is a very crude schematic that is purely an artistic renderation, means nothing. There's no physical basis behind anything shown here, other than this would be well 16A. 16A has essentially a 200-foot open hole section at the toe and 2 plug and perf stimulated zones. The 16B here would be some distance directly above, as the planning goes right now, with nominally planning for a 500-foot open hole section. This distance is something we need to make recommendations on. But there's other things, from a modeling perspective, what kind of data types, if we do flow testing, if we do short-term testing, confirmation testing, what kind of data would you like to see as a modeler to be able to essentially tell me more about what happens between well A and well B? I'm looking for input. Is there a basis for, what basis would you have for estimating or recommending a distance between these two wells? What kind of instrumentation? And if no one starts speaking up or raises their hand, I'm going to start calling on people who I know may want to weigh into this. So does anyone want to volunteer to be to start this discussion? I will make one other point while I'm waiting for someone to chime in, is looking only at the pressure histories from the stimulations. It appeared that, based on our preliminary pre-stimulation models, we did bracket we did a pretty good job bracketing the number of microseismic events that came in from our models. And we also, what we did see is the pressure signature from the open hole toe more closely matched our sensitivity case for a weak DFN for the DFN, the native pressures, which would be more susceptible, so the DFN be easier to stimulate. So that's what the pressure history matched. For our perforated zones, our pressure more closely matched something for a more narrow shaped, closely tighter fracture growth. So Karen, I see your question here. I will start. Also, I'll do my best. So the plan right now would be for long-term testing. 16A, in my estimation, is the planned injector for the long-term testing. At least that's in my process, but there is no, it doesn't have to be. I think these wells will be loosely designed enough that we can flow them in either direction. But I think 16A will be the one we do most of our stimulations will come from initially. I think that is largely the plan there.
So Rob, can you hear me? This is Ahmad.
I can hear you. Who is that? Who's
How you doing? This is Ahmad. How's it going?
Oh, great, Ahmad. How are you? Thank you for volunteering.
So yeah, I have a comment really. I mean, so the assumption that I guess the assumption implicitly is that you're just looking for a connection, not necessarily the best connection. Or is this indicative of the best possible connection between the two wells?
Well, so there's multiple issues at play, and so we'll be able to have a little bit better informed decision. So the base plan, without any further information, is that will offset directly above. It seemed we had pretty much strongly upward fracture growth or upward stimulation or upward microseismic, from 16A. Now, your point as to a connection versus the best connection is very, very what I'm trying to get to is, if we want to just guarantee a connection, we could put these wells 25 meters apart and be pretty certain we're going to hit them. But there's other things we need to do with these wells. So as I said earlier, we do long-term heat extraction flow tests, look at tracer tests between the wells, characterize the created fractures. So, we're actually, as a forge modeling team, we're doing right now, while we've been waiting for all the seismic data to be processed, we're doing 2 sensitivity cases for modeling for breakthrough times for both conservative and thermal breakthrough. One would be for a simple penny-shaped crack set that is 100 or 450 feet tall, essentially, or a little bit more than 450 feet, and one for essentially it would be something like this, a fairly narrow single fracture, and one that's a complex. And so we're looking at different breakthrough times in that, so we can optimize essentially 1, confirming connection, 2, and if we're going to do long-term flow tests, like my question is and I like to get as much input as we can here, is how much how much thermal breakthrough. I mean, so usually strong thermal breakthrough for a geothermal doublet is a fail, right? But for us, that could be a good data point. So do we want thermal breakthrough? And if so, do we want it to happen in 3 days, or do it happen in 3 months? Those are the kind of questions I think we need to really think out very well as we design this separation distance. So we're modeling some basic cases to kind of bracket essentially a conservative breakthrough versus a thermal breakthrough for a number of different, essentially simple and complex fracture domains right now. And as the stimulation data, as this microseismic get back, we'll constrain those further to further modify those fracture domains for that. I'm rambling, Ahmad. I don't know if I answered your question, but please come back.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you. Yes. But I just wanted to emphasize essentially that the distance, of course, you can fix at 500, which is what you have suggested. It's pretty good. So, but the orientation, whether it's right, exactly above or not, I mean that really would depend on the nature of the connection between the stimulation and the DFN that existed. And so, if the best fluid flow pathway is upward, this would be the most efficient connection. But if it so happens that the hydraulic stimulation, and I call it hydraulic stimulation as opposed to hydraulic fracturing in this case, if that hydraulic stimulation somehow connected a more permeable path in a different direction, then this may not necessarily be the best connection, that one could establish. So, and I understand there's a lot of uncertainty, associated with that, because we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know what the
Yeah, we don't know what we don't know, right? And so that's part of the problem. And so that's something that I struggle with, and that we had a very long, lengthy discussion even with the stat a few weeks ago. Is this, and so the original point, and lack of any other information, is essentially this separate, so the basis for and for this right now, for the starting point, this distance is 300 feet or 100 meters, and this is a 500-foot open hole toe, and this trajectory is exactly above, and it matches 16A. That's our basis default, and now we're trying to evaluate, is that the best? Because as I said, there's so many different things we can try to optimize on, but the key is getting connection. So,
Rob, this is Mukul Sharma. I'll just make a comment and suggest a couple of things. The measurements that the UT Shell team and the Rice Silixa team plan to make are these fiber optic measurements, which are going to be in the 16B well, which are basically going to be DTS, DAS, and strain measurements. So you should have information in the cased section of the wellbore for temperature, pressure, strain, and any. So those measurements are going to be available in addition to some of the other measurements, the microseismic and so on, that of course will be available as well. In my view, all of the diagnostic work really should be directed towards two things that we can control. One is the distance and the location of the 16B well, whether it's 300 feet or 500 feet above 16A, and where it's located directly above or slightly offset. That's a decision that'll have to be made early. But then the second very important thing is the design of the completion, how many clusters, how many perforations, and the design of the frac itself, because ultimately that's going to control what these fracs look like. And so I think some degree of flexibility on the optimization of the fracture treatment is going to be extremely useful and important. And then doing all the diagnostics to see whether we can get better or worse connectivity, better or worse flow rates and heat exchange and so forth between the wells. So making a decision on what to vary in the frac design and in the completion design, I think it will be really interesting from our point of view.
That brings up a good point. And there's other questions here, but what you prompted me, I'm going to just jump ahead by one slide. And this is just meant to start a conversation. It's something that I think is very interesting to me, is, well hydraulics versus fracture hydraulics and preferential flow in the reservoir. We've been looking at some simplified computational fluid dynamics runs for the flow of the pipe, flow through the perforations, and simulated fracture and through some fractures, just for this very case at all. I should also mention that there are practical limitations on the size of the pump we could use for an outflow system. So that, our design right now is looking at essentially a pump that can make about 250 gallons a minute, which, depending on the fluid temperature, that's 12 to maybe 14 to 13 to maybe 15 or 16 kilograms per second. And I apologize for all you oil patch guys. I don't have that in barrels per minute, but it's not all that many barrels. But the important thing that you bring up, Mukul, is essentially with those three open zones, some of them have we have some pressure drop across those perforation zones and the open hole toe. And so what you're seeing here in this slide, this is provisional also. I mean, this by intern just handed me these last night. But what you're seeing here essentially is pressure on the inflow side and on the outflow side. So the outflow side, if we fix the pressure at 300 degree or 300 PSI, I'm mixing units, I apologize. So we keep the fluid single phase. If it's coming up at about 200 C, we're putting fluid in on the order of 25 C. We get a pretty strong density drive just from the weight of that fluid. So we don't need a whole lot of pumping power pushing fluid in. But the important part here is, don't worry about, there's some little things happen here, but the important part is that open hole zone, without having any pressure drop across the perforations, it's taken essentially, 90 some percent of all the fluid is going through just that lower zone. So you're exactly right, Nicole, of that, how we essentially parameterize, how we design the completion design is going to have, or can potentially have, a very strong effect on how we get flow through the reservoir, especially when we get more and more, more clusters as we go along the well.
Hey, Rob,
Rob,
this
can
is
I make a
Karen.
comment? Or Karen, if you want to go first?
Good, Karen.
Yeah, I just wanted to build off what Nicole said. The fact that we have fiber, we're going to have fiber in the cased hole section, right, of the 16B. We can somehow we need to re-stimulate 16A before we do any stimulation in 16B to see a response, like a cross well strain response in that fiber in the 16B. So it could be as simple as maybe we can just do what you just said, is just pump back into the 16A and see if we can reopen those fractures that we've already generated. Or it may have to, depending, you're showing that the third stimulation is still going to hit the open hole section, but you're not going to have fiber there. I don't know.
That's purely
just the
artistic,
cartoon.
Karen. Yeah, that's purely artistic. I don't
Yeah.
know. I have no idea where these are. That's why I said, don't hold me
Yeah.
to where these things show up.
But, what we want to do is be able to see, this is our best chance of seeing that fracture hit the 16B, is to re-stimulate or do a new stimulation in the 16A before we initiate a frac in the 16B.
I would
That's
agree.
true, Karen. Rob, can I just make a comment? Because I think people may not be aware of what the plan is.
Sure.
And so, yeah, what Rob's got up there is conceptual. The idea was that open hole to open hole, and then the second stimulation would be in the open hole section, and then the uppermost stimulation would be behind casing. So we would measure that. The stimulation plan is actually twofold. So to address some of the earlier questions, the first stimulation would be done with rig pumps or a pump truck brought on site immediately after the drilling of 16B. There would be no additional stimulations or large scale stimulations at that point, and there would be at this point no plan to do additional perforations. We would then, after the information that we get from this rig test, we would define the plan for a full-scale stimulation, much like we already did with the Liberty trucks, although I'm not, we don't know if it'll be Liberty, but much like the one we did, develop the plan in concert with the groups that are involved, in concert with Rob's group, with Rice, with Austin, and develop a stimulation plan, go ahead and do the stimulation, and then begin long-term testing based on what we've learned. So it's a twofold approach, and we recognize that this is probably the best way to move forward on that.
Joe,
Go ahead.
I think maybe I misheard you. I think we did have some plans in for some flow testing even after B is completed, but before A is re-stimulated. We did have some things in our plans for some, I'm not sure what the time frame, but we had flow testing plans in there. Is that still correct?
That is correct. So
Okay.
that, right now that may be just a rig test or bring in a pump truck, but not a large scale stimulation, and certainly not expected to perforate these wells beyond what we've already done. So we would locate using the fibers where there are intersections with B, and ultimately develop that plan. And I think that is a reasonable, cautious approach. Yeah, I do recognize that getting too close could be a problem. Collision analyses will be conducted, and there will be constant directional surveys being done. We certainly don't want to do that. I see Peter's got a question, and spinner logs is one way to do this, Peter, to look where those intersections are. Obviously, behind casing, we'll use the fibers to see where we have fracture intersections. Hopefully, I've answered some of the questions that I know you're concerned about. I'll let you go ahead, Rob.
Thanks, Joe. So the coming back in here, Karen, did you have another question, Karen, or is your comment? Are you finished?
Yeah, I'm finished. I think it's okay to stimulate that open hole section on the 16B, because you can still do a set of bridge plug and isolate that casing in your fiber.
Okay. I'm looking through some of the questions here. Matt Becker, how will the injection test be carried out with stim crew or circulation pump? I think the answer is both. Initially, I think Joe, hopefully Joe answered your question well enough, but initially, I think when we first get done drilling the well, when the rig is still there, we'll do initial test to confirm connection, to see some fluid come through, see some pressure change, whatever that may be. And then later on, as we do longer tests, we'll likely use a circulation pump. We have all that stuff started to get spec'd out right now. Peter, saw your question there. I think that's been kind of moved on. Spacing question from Luke has been answered. Eric, you're exactly right. There's two ways to look at it. Tracers coming through, and I say tracer in a generic sense, some conservative breakthrough of something coming through, and then later on with the thermal, we get a good idea about heat exchange areas. That's why we decided to do our initial planning or modeling for this, Eric, to look at both conservative and a tracer. So we're developing, and I love some input on this, but we're trying to develop essentially an objective function that looks at the difference between the conservative breakthrough and a thermal breakthrough, essentially center of mass or center time of those breakthroughs. So we can look at somewhat quantitatively for what that'd be and how that can inform later on for how long a test would actually need to take. Love any more, realize that, and as we get more, we'll do more realizations on it. Luke, that flow rate right now, at least based for the submersible pump that can, for the outflow side production pump, 250 GPM is something we have planned. That maybe we can go a little higher. That really comes into about between 12 and say 15 or 16 kilograms per second, depending on what the density of that fluid is. 5.9 inches is pretty tight, but we're trying to have a pump that could be on a variable frequency drive, so we could essentially meter those flow rates. Concern I have, and a concern we've been looking at, is if we depressurize that extraction well too fast, and if there's any pressure support in the fractures, we can essentially close them down and have to essentially cause us more of a serious problem. So we'll have to let it pressurize up and then slowly bring that flow rate, the flow rate out. Matt, who is leading the tracer testing, that is something we're all working on together. Tracers in general for the forest team, that's Pete Rose at EGI. Joe, correct me if I'm wrong. But the overall plan for these flow tests is essentially a mix between hydraulic characterization, tracers, geochemistry. So there's a lot of voices in here. I've essentially just stood the modeling team up to be the integrator of all those voices, because we could test a lot of these hypotheses and make some predictions of what we might expect. So that's where that's coming from. You have input, be glad to hear anything more from you. So Peter's question is, how can the flow contribution from each of the three existing fracs be determined? That, I think, is a very key consideration. And my argument, and I'd like to get the community's input, is we need to lay a fiber in DTS fiber or DS fiber or both through the inside the casing all the way to the very bottom toe of both A and B when we do these tests. And that way we can actually see where some very minor temperature or pressure changes, or at least perturbations in the flow, happen as flow enters or leaves the wells. From my preliminary CFD modeling on the perforations, there's a pretty high sensitivity. You know, what I don't know, and I'm not convinced by some of the things in literature for these crystalline rocks, is if we did a perforation cluster that we did, you know, it's what, 6 shots per foot over 20 feet. If we have 100 perforations or so, how many of those are actually contributing to flow leaving the well? It's our pressure drop is very sensitive to that. So we've done a bunch of sensitivity analyses here. I don't have a slide for it, but essentially, of course, the more of those you have, the less impact, the less impact you have from the perforations themselves. The fewer that are active, the larger the pressure drop. And when you have an open hole toe, essentially there's a large pressure drop for the perforations that doesn't exist in the toe, and it's going to still keep taking the most of the fluid. So I see lots of questions coming here right now. If people rather just kind of raise their hand and talk, I'm fine with that. It might be a little bit more constructive than me reading, but I'm happy to keep doing what we're doing. Karen, surface pressure gauge, 16A, agreed. Thank you for that. Okay, measuring surface pressure, at least for initial connection, no matter which way we pump, we should be able to see if we see a pressure perturbation, that would be indicating that we have connection for sure. Matt, send me an email as far as involved in the discussions. Happy to take as much as we can. We will be preparing some flow testing plans, and I think we will make those plans. We'll take as much input as we can initially, and then we'll actually open those plans up for a community to review and get input on. I think it's critical. So. Okay, question as far as where are the 3 stages in the 16A current schematic. So stage 1 is here in the open hole toe. The stage 2, which is the first perforation zone, that happened from a measured depth of 10,560, and I'm turning around with my whiteboard, to 10,580. This open hole toe was from 10,787 to 10,987, so there is 200 feet. And the second perforation zone happened from 10,120 to 10,140. Eric, different tracers for each interval. I love that. I think early on, we're just going to be able to just do essentially for confirmation, we're just going to push fluid into A and see if we get a pressure perturbation B or vice versa. And later on, we start doing individual high detail testing where we'll have to come up with ways to understand where the flow is going to, whether we'll be able to have a plug or some way to actually only put flow into certain zones. That would be the ideal thing, or at least in my opinion, because I really want to try to characterize what is the effective, essentially fracture surface area and permeability of these different stimulations. So can we get some quantified or quantitative information as to if we get a different response from those? So looking through questions here. Thanks, Jesse. I see that. Okay, I'll take all these down and put them in my notebook as we go on with the team as we start building these things. Okay. Are we trying to produce from the case portion of 16B? So not until it gets perforated. I think, we're not going to produce fluid through essentially a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch thick steel pipe. But eventually, Luke, yes, there will be plans for additional stimulations that would happen here that would essentially, I wish I could edit this slide, but so we will have more stimulations that will happen in A or perhaps happen in B, and wherever we see based on the measurements where they encounter that well, we can come back through and perf after the fact to try to essentially connect them there. So McCool, who's responsible for in well uncemented fiber? No one. That has not even been a decision point. That is something that's on that if the community thinks it would be a good idea, that's something I could argue for. We could try to get into the plan, but right now it's just we're gathering information here. But I think some of that kind of information, at least for early testing, could be very beneficial to identify if we have a diffuse fracture network that came in from the toe, how many of these fracture intersections or how many fractures did B encounter and how much fluid comes from each one of those. That's a question I think is a very big science question that we have pretty unique capability to answer here. But all that stuff is still, as I said, it's under consideration. So if you have strong feelings, please email me and we'll try to get as much as we can of the plan as we go. So I'm answering a lot of questions. Joe, do you have any further comments? The questions seem to have slowed down.
No, I think
other suggestions are welcome for any of these kind of testing.
I think these are excellent suggestions, and we are starting to formulate a plan. So I appreciate them.
Exactly.
Question, just keep them coming. We will weigh deployment issues versus research issues, and see what we can come up with.
Yeah, that's a good point, Joe. Something I should lay out here is like, there are very definitive operational goals and deadlines and things we have to meet as a forged team with our relationship with DOE. There are also very important science questions and very important just flow and transport questions that we also need to return. So it's a balancing act between what we want to do, what we can do, and what we have the budget for. And so Joe, unfortunately, is the one walking that razor's edge all the time. So he has the unique capability of never making anybody happy. I think it's a good way to put it. But we're doing the best we can to accommodate everything that we can that we need to do. Will we be able to get everything we want? No. But what we don't want to do is essentially make some decisions now that can have a negative impact later on down the road. Okay, thanks, McCool. Joe, that was a question about lead time for fibers. So,
I was just talking about the in-well fiber. If that's something that you would like to see done, then I think we need to make that decision, or at least think about it early, because it's going to take some time to actually make that kind of fiber at the high temperature.
Very good point. Okay. So Luke, speak your piece. I see your comment here. If you're going to throw something out there, I don't know if you're alone, but yeah, please just unmute yourself.
Sure. So one thing that I've been learning from my modeling efforts, for better or for worse, depending on how good they are, but it does seem that the idea that thermal breakthrough is a killer for geothermal seems to be potentially wrong. Essentially, as long as the enthalpy coming out of the ground is high enough, you can get power out of it, right? So getting a better characterization of what that thermal decline curve looks like could be absolutely huge for alleviating fears about the longevity of these systems, right? So, essentially what some of my models are saying is that if you allow for a little bit more cooling of the water coming out of the production well, but yet still are producing high enough enthalpy to make power from it, you can end up in a scenario where you actually get significantly more power out of the subsurface just by allowing a little bit more temperature decline. In terms of a thermodynamics or thermal conductivity perspective, the physics of why are pretty straightforward. Does that make sense?
No, I understand your point, and I don't 100% disagree. I think if we had a power plant engineer here on the call, they would take you to task because of the fluid, those plants are pretty tightly designed around a temperature range, and they become less and less efficient as that temperature goes down. But I think having that kind of information is, even if nothing else, if we see a thermal breakthrough, perhaps we could come up with ways to remediate it within our system. And so that's one of the things I'm actively very interested in is if we start looking at a 3-well scenario where we can actually optimize pumping and injection scenarios to change those heat sweeps to move the reservoir so we can keep a constant flow of a more uniform temperature over a lot longer period of time by being smart in how where we put fluid in and where we take it out. So yeah, lots of opportunity for additional research there for an optimization for sure.
Yeah, Rob, if I could add to what Luke was saying, based on the simulations that we've run on the heat recovery, there is an optimum connectivity between wells. If the wells are too well connected, you don't recover sufficient heat over a sufficient period of time. And of course, if they're very poorly connected, then you have the opposite problem. So there is an optimum connectivity where you have sufficient flow allowed at the pressures that you can have, and also have enough heat recovery and enough connectivity where you're actually extracting heat from a large portion of the rock, as opposed to just a thief zone taking all the fluid. So I think it's a good point that you really need to achieve some optimum connectivity, whatever that might be, between the wells.
Well, I would say that by next month's meeting, I'll have my model, my guys that are doing this modeling, I'll have to give the results for some of this, where we're trying to answer, at least provide insight to this distance question. And we actually have some real numbers to look at and to get some different, maybe get some better input on there. So it'd be more of a presentation and then a discussion as part of more of an open discussion. But I think that really, I definitely agree with you. That's the challenge we have is without knowing for sure, the nature of the permeability of those fractures and how, whether is it a penny shaped crack or really narrow fracture zone, or is it, is the DFN, and we have conflicting data. So, once we have a little bit better information, we can try to do some calibration and history matching from our from our simulation models. Hopefully that'll help reduce some of those uncertainties, at least in my mind.
But Rob, based on the
could I add a little bit more?
based on the pressure data, I think you only have one hydraulic fracture in zone 3. The other two, I mean, even that one is kind of maybe later connecting to something. But that's what it seems to me.
Okay, and that's kind of what we're thinking too. But then it comes to the question, Ahmad, is why the difference in behavior? Is it just for the completion part, or is it because the first stage was because open hole and maybe started with the multiple fractures, or why? And so and what is better? I mean, I think the thought has been if we can get a whole bunch of a very diffuse, highly complex fracture network, has lots of surface area, where we can get lots of tortuous flow paths, essentially have a long flow path between the wells, we get a better heat recovery. But if we can get, but there's other people have postulated or in favor, if we can just get a whole bunch of narrow penny shaped cracks and be more of an oil filled model, we could stack up a whole lot of clusters a lot closer together and we still have some separation from them. That in my mind is an unanswered question, and so I'm really excited to be working on it, to be honest with you.
So Rob, one thing I'd like to add to that I did mention earlier is the uniqueness of fit part of the problem. So, tracer data is really good. It's essential for predicting what might happen, but without having that validation of what actually does happen regarding the thermal behavior, we're still kind of missing a big piece of the puzzle. And in order to answer that, in order to get that piece of the puzzle uniquely, so we actually know that we're fitting the right system behavior to the thermal data, we actually need quite a big thermal decline. Just little bits of thermal decline, there's a non-uniqueness problem in fitting that data. So more thermal decline in this case, while bad in terms of if we were trying to produce power, it's actually quite good in terms of answering scientific questions.
I don't disagree with you, sir. I'm of a similar thought. Is small perturbations can be very ambiguous. Even big ones can be, but either way, I agree with you.
Just to break in again.
Yeah,
So
of course.
once the larger stimulation is done, for assumption, we'll assume that we drill B in the first quarter of 2023. Sometime in mid-year, we conduct the larger stimulation based on what we've learned, what the fiber is telling us, what the seismic is telling us. And then our project right now will continue through about September 2024. So most of the time after that stimulation will be devoted to longer term flow testing. And at that point, we'll begin to understand temperature declines. The work that Rob is doing will fit into that. We have submitted an extension to the DOE for basically 2025 through 2030. That extension includes drilling a third well. It would be 16C. No idea whether it's going to be above or below or to the side of these wells, but it would certainly increase the size of the reservoir and the dominant activity in those following years would be the flow testing, heat extraction, and understanding the fracture set. So hopefully that will help in the long-term plans. Details are still to be worked out.
Thanks, Joe. I just poorly typed a note into the chat. because I was trying to get done, start talking again, but I put my email in there and I misspelled it into the next thing, but if you want to follow up and elaborate on any of your comments, please email them to me. And I'll essentially assemble all that and move it along and make sure it gets as part of the discussion. Other questions, comments from anyone? I like this discussion where we're at right now. I know there's a whole bunch of different ways to approach this thing, and so that's why I'm trying to get as many voices into this discussion as possible.
Rob, thank you for leading this discussion.
Oh, my pleasure. And
I
thanks.
think
thanks for
it's
joining.
critically important.
Thanks, Joe. So once again, thanks everyone for joining today. Any further clarification, please reach out. My email address is in the chat, and we can go from there. So thanks, everyone. I'm looking forward to interacting with you again here soon. And once the data come available, we will start sending out some notices. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, have a great day. Thanks, Eric.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rob.
Bye.